Extract from The Darling River by Henry Lawson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. We once travelled on the Darling for 100 miles or so on a boat called the Mud Turtle. At least that's what we called her. She might reasonably have haunted the Mississippi 50 years ago. She didn't seem particular where she went, or whether she started again or stopped for good after getting stuck. Her machinery sounded like a chapter of accidents and was always out of order, but she got along all the same, provided the steersman kept her off the bank. Her skipper was a young man who looked more like a drover than a sailor, and the crew bore a greater resemblance to the unemployed than to any other body we know of, except that they looked a little more independent. They seemed clannish, too, with an unemployed or free labour sort of isolation. We have an idea that they regarded our personal appearance with contempt. Above Louth we picked up a whaler, who came aboard for the sake of society and tobacco. Not that he hoped to shorten his journey. He had no destination. He told us many reckless and unprincipled lies and gave us a few ornamental facts. One of them took our fancy and impressed us, with its beautiful simplicity, I suppose. He said, "Some miles above where the Darling and the Warrego runs into one another, there's a billabong running right across the two rivers and making a sort of triangular island, and I can tell you a funny thing about it." Here he paused to light his pipe. "Now," he continued, impressively jerking the match overboard, "when the Darling's up and the Warrego's low, the billabong runs from the Darling into the Warrego, and when the Warrego's up and the Darling's down, the waters run from the Warrego into the Darling." What could be more simple? The steamer was engaged to go up a billabong for a load of shearers from a shed which was cutting out, and first it was necessary to tie up in the river and discharge the greater portion of the cargo in order that the boat might safely negotiate the shallow waters. A local fisherman, who volunteered to act as pilot, was taken aboard, and after he was outside about a pint of whisky he seemed to have the greatest confidence in his ability to take us to hell or anywhere else. At least he said so. A man was sent ashore with blankets and tucker to mind the wool, and we crossed the river, butted into the Anna branch and started out back. Only the Lord and the pilot know how we got there. We travelled over the bush, through its branches sometimes, and sometimes through grass and mud, and every now and then we struck something that felt and sounded like a collision. The boat slid down one hill and fetched a stump at the bottom with a force that made every mother's son bite his tongue or break a tooth. The shearers came aboard next morning with their swags and 2 cartloads of boiled mutton, bread, brownie, and tea and sugar. They numbered about 50, including the rouseabouts. This load of sin sank the steamer deeper into the mud, but the passengers crowded over to port by request of the captain, and the crew poked the bank away with long poles. When we began to move, the shearers gave a howl like the yell of a legion of lost souls escaping from down below. They gave 3 cheers for the rouseabout's cook, who stayed behind. Then they cursed the station with a mighty curse. They cleared a space on deck, had a jig, and afterwards a fight between the shearer's cook and his assistant. They gave a mighty bush whoop for the Darling when the boat swung into that grand old gutter, and in the evening they had a general all-round time. We got back, and the crew had to reload the wool without assistance, for it bore the accursed brand of a freedom of contract shed. We slept, or tried to sleep, that night on the ridge of 2 wool bales laid with the narrow sides up, having first been obliged to get ashore and fight 6 rounds with a shearer for the privilege of roosting there. The live cinders from the firebox went up the chimney all night and fell in showers on deck. Every now and again a spark would burn through the wagga rug of a sleeping shearer, and he'd wake suddenly and get up and curse. It was no use shifting round, for the wind was all ways, and the boat steered north, south, east, and west to humour the river. Occasionally a low branch would root 3 or 4 passengers off their wool bales, and they'd get up and curse in chorus. The boat started 2 snags, and towards daylight struck a stump. The accent was on the stump. A wool bale went overboard and took a swag and a dog with it. Then the owner of the swag and dog and the crew of the boat had a swearing match between them. The swagman won. About daylight we stretched our cramped limbs, extricated one leg from between the wool bales, and found that the steamer was just crayfishing away from a mud island, where she had tied up for more wool. Some of the chaps had been ashore and boiled 4 or 5 buckets of tea and coffee. Shortly after the boat had settled down to work again, an incident came along. A rouseabout rose late, and, while the others were at breakfast, got an idea into his head that a good sloosh would freshen him up. So he mooched around until he found a big wooden bucket with a rope to it. He carried the bucket aft of the wheel. The boat was butting upstream for all she was worth, and the stream was running the other way, of course, and about 100 times as fast as a train. The jackaroo gave the line a turn round his wrist. Before anyone could see him in time to suppress him, he lifted the bucket, swung it to and fro, and dropped it cleverly into the water. This delayed us for nearly an hour. A couple of men jumped into the rowboat immediately and cast her adrift. They picked up the jackaroo about a mile down the river, clinging to a snag, and when we hauled him aboard he looked like something the cat had dragged in, only bigger. We revived him with rum and got him on his feet, and then, when the captain and crew had done cursing him, he rubbed his head, went forward and had a look at the paddle. Then he rubbed his head again, thought, and remarked to his mates, "Wasn't it lucky I didn't dip the bucket forward the wheel?" This remark struck us forcibly. We agreed that it was lucky for him, but the captain remarked that it was damned unlucky for the world, which, he explained, was overpopulated with fools already. Getting on towards afternoon, we found a barge loaded with wool and tied up to a tree in the wilderness. There was no sign of a man to be seen, nor any sign, except the barge, that a human being had ever been there. The captain took the craft in tow, towed it about 10 miles up the stream, and left it in a less likely place than where it was before. Floating bottles began to be more frequent, and we knew by that same token that we were nearing Here's Luck Burke, we mean, and this reminds us. When the Brewarrina people observe a more than ordinary number of bottles floating down the river, they guess that Walgett is on the spree. When the Louth chaps see an unbroken procession of dead marines for 2 or 3 days, they know that Burke's drunk. The poor God-abandoned whaler sits in his hungry camp at sunset and watches the empty symbols of hope go by, and feels more God-forgotten than ever, and thirstier if possible, and gets a great, wide, thirsty, quaking, empty longing to be up where those bottles come from. If the townspeople knew how much misery they cause by their thoughtlessness, they would drown their dead marines or bury them, but on no account allow them to go drifting down the river and stirring up hells in the bosoms of less fortunate fellow creatures. There came a man from Adelaide to Burke once, and he collected all the empty bottles in town, stacked them by the river, and waited for a boat. What he wanted them for, the legend saith not, but the people reckoned he had a private still, or something of that sort, somewhere down the river, and were satisfied. What he came from Adelaide for, or whether he really did come from there, we do not know. All the darling bunyips are supposed to come from Adelaide. Anyway, the man collected all the empty bottles he could lay his hands on and piled them on the bank, where they made a good show. He waited for a boat to take his cargo, and while waiting he got drunk. That excited no comment. He stayed drunk for 3 weeks, but the townsfolk saw nothing unusual in that. In order to become an object of interest in their eyes and in that line, he would have had to stay drunk for a year and fight 3 times a day, oftener if possible, and lie in the road in the broiling heat between whiles, and be walked on by camels and Afghans and free labourers, and be locked up every time he got sober enough to smash a policeman and try to hang himself naked, and finally be squashed by a loaded wool team. But while he drank, the Darling rose, for reasons best known to itself, and floated those bottles off. They strung out and started for the Antarctic Ocean with a big old wickerwork demijohn in the lead. For the first week the down river men took no notice, but after the bottles had been drifting past with scarcely a break for a fortnight or so, they began to get interested. Several whalers watched the procession until they got the jim jams by force of imagination, and when their bodies began to float down with the bottles, the downriver people got anxious. At last the Mayor of Wilcannia wired Burke to know whether Dibbs or Parkes was dead, or democracy triumphant, or, if not, wherefore the jubilation. Many telegrams of a like nature were received during that week, and the true explanation was sent in reply to each. But it wasn't believed, and to this day Burke has the name of being the most drunken town on the river. End of Extract from The Darling River by Henry Lawson.